Do you believe there will come a day when the very daughter I raised with my sweat and blood would drag me into court, demanding to strip me of the company I built over 30 years, only to sell it to a foreign corporation and fire thousands of loyal employees? If not for an unexpected twist, by now I would have become a senile old man in the eyes of the world. But she never imagined I was still lucid enough to teach her a lifelong lesson. Before I reveal the entire truth behind this shock, please subscribe to the channel and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Your support is the motivation that keeps me exposing the stories that few dare to speak out. That evening, Seattle was drenched in a cold rain that had lasted since the afternoon. I had just put on my gray trench coat, ready to drive to Bellevue for dinner with my daughter, when the phone in my pocket vibrated. The screen lit up with a short message, sharp as a knife. Call me immediately. Emergency about Claire. The sender was Michael Reed, the lawyer who had stood by me for more than 20 years. Michael was the type of man who was calm, seasoned, always composed, even in the most stressful situations. That was why just seeing him write the words emergency and Claire in the same sentence made my spine turn cold. I called back immediately, my hand gripping so tightly that my nails dug into my skin. On the other end, Michael's voice came, brief but heavy as lead. Bill, I need to warn you right now. Claire has filed a lawsuit. I froze in the hallway, my heart struck like a hammer blow. I asked again, hoarsely, whether there was some mistake, but Michael was steady and firm. She has filed with King County Court, requesting to declare you incompetent to run Carter Systems. If the petition is accepted, Claire will temporarily take over as CEO, and you will have to undergo a psychiatric evaluation and medical examination. The city outside blurred behind the glass window. Seattle, with its bridges spanning Lake Union and its skyscrapers glowing every night, suddenly became a strange place. I braced myself on the table, my breath heavy. Claire, my daughter, the one I once held by the hand to school, the one I gave a small gold ring on her 18th birthday, was now standing on the other side. I muttered unconsciously, "She is my daughter. This can't be happening." But Michael left me no hope. He said Claire had already convinced at least 5 major shareholders, including James Corbin, a notoriously greedy investor who always craved higher dividends, and Patricia Wheeler, a cold woman who valued numbers above all else. They were already meeting in secret. How long until trial? I asked, my voice breaking. Michael answered, 1 week. The first hearing. We must sprint. I strolled toward the window of my office. The Seattle rain tapped like cold fingers on the glass. From the 48th floor of Carter Tower, I looked down at the city that had witnessed 3 decades of my career. So many certificates of merit, so many grand openings, so many million-dollar contracts had started here. I had built Carter Systems from a small garage in Capitol Hill, turning it into a corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and all I believed was that I had done it for my family. But now, my own daughter thought I was no longer capable. Michael continued, his voice steady but grave. They would point to the changes in me since Elena's passing. They would say I had become sentimental, nostalgic, easily moved, that I was no longer sharp enough to lead the company. They gathered enough documents, including meeting minutes, which showed that I had vehemently opposed the plan to implement artificial intelligence across all processes, including the annual donations to the charity named after my wife. They would wrap it all in one argument. I no longer put shareholders' interests first, but acted only on personal feelings. I closed my eyes. Memories of Elena rushed back. She once told me, "Bill, don't let work steal away the family." I did not listen. I thought I was sacrificing for them. That sleepless nights and endless business trips were proof of love. But now that very sacrifice was twisted into evidence against me. I asked in anguish, why would Claire do this? What for? Michael answered bluntly, She talks about the future, about merging Carter Systems with Inotech Global, the giant tech corporation in California. She promised shareholders a 15% dividend increase every year. But Bill, you and I both know that merger will put 3,000 employees on the street. At that moment, my heart felt crushed. I had foreseen ambition in my daughter, but never thought she would choose this path. A path ready to turn people who had devoted their lives, from lab engineers to night guards, into cold numbers in a personnel cost reduction report. I stood silent in the dark office, surrounded by walls hung with certificates and memories. Every light, every medal, every milestone seemed meaningless. The call ended, but its echo weighed on my chest. I put on my coat, grabbed my car keys, and stepped into the elevator. 48 floors down felt like an entire lifetime. Leaving the garage, I merged into the city traffic, the rain still pounding against the windshield. I wondered, should I still go to that dinner? To sit across from Claire, force a smile, eat roasted chicken while she plotted every step to erase her father's name from the company? But I knew I had to go. I needed to look straight into those eyes, to see what kind of person my beloved daughter had become. The SUV moved heavily through the rain, the wipers beating like war drums. Inside me, fear and anger intertwined, but there flickered a cold light. If this was the greatest battle of my life, I would not run. And I understood everything had only just begun. That night, I drove through the pouring rain, water streaking across the windshield, like memories that could not be erased. In my head echoed Michael's words. 1 week. We must sprint 1 week to fight against my own daughter. 1 week to defend the company I had spent 30 years building. I remembered clearly the very first day Carter Systems was founded. Back then, all I had was a small garage, an old computer, and an idea many called crazy. My wife Elena was the only one who believed and stood by me. She even pawned her wedding ring so I could have starting capital. And from that leap of faith, Carter Systems was born, grew, and became a tech corporation worth nearly $500 million. I once thought the greatest gift I could leave for Claire was this legacy. Yet now that legacy had turned into a battlefield, where father and daughter faced each other. As the car neared Bellevue, I saw the warm golden lights from Claire's house shining through the rain, cozy and peaceful. I wondered, inside that home, did my daughter feel even a shred of hesitation as she decided to stab her father so deeply? Or had she already become someone else, cold and steely, like the financial charts she always presented in meetings? I still remember the early days when Claire first joined the company. She was smart, quick, and beloved by employees. I was proud to introduce her to partners, convinced I had found a worthy successor. I spent years teaching her the smallest details, how to read reports, how to negotiate with clients, how to stand firm under pressure. But as she grew, Claire changed. She no longer saw people behind the numbers, no longer remembered that every report represented hundreds of families relying on wages. To Claire, the company was just a money-making machine that needed to accelerate. To me, it was a second family, a place where I valued both loyalty and employees' smiles. Michael had been clear in the call. Claire had persuaded James Corbin. That name alone chilled me. Corbin was a veteran investor, notorious for greed. He always demanded higher dividends, willing to pressure management to cut benefits and fire workers. I had often clashed with him, even flatly refusing his proposal to cut 20% of the workforce to boost quarterly profit. Now he was on Claire's side. It was not hard to imagine what she had promised. Fat dividends, soaring profits, a bright future, but all built on discarded lives, employees thrown out to the streets. Patricia Wheeler was also among them. I knew Patricia, who once worked at a large investment fund, always worshiping terms like strategic restructuring and optimized market capitalization. I was sick of hearing them because I knew behind those glossy words lay the blood and tears of workers. Patricia saw Carter Systems as just a figure on a spreadsheet, not a place of lifelong engineers, loyal accountants from the first day, or elderly guards still proud to wear their uniforms every morning. And then there were three other young shareholders. I could picture their faces, up-and-comers in the tech investment world, hungry for quick wealth, seeing the company as nothing more than a goose that laid golden eggs. Claire had spoken to them about the prospect of a merger with Initech Global, a name making waves on NASDAQ. Just one signature and the stock would skyrocket. Profits would roll in instantly. They did not care that 3,000 employees would lose their jobs, nor did they care that the company culture would be crushed. They only wanted money, and Claire gave them exactly that. Thinking of that prospect made my chest tighten. In 30 years, I had never once thought of the company as mine alone. I saw it as belonging to all, a home for thousands. I remembered the face of the engineer who had worked for 18 years, always bowing with respect when he saw me. I remembered the HR employee who once cried, while telling me her son had gone to college, thanks to the company's scholarship. I remembered the old guard who stood at the lobby every morning, smiling warmly with a cup of coffee in hand. To me, Carter Systems was them, not just profit lines on a report. And now all of it could be swept away with a single merger signature. The rain kept pounding against the windshield, as though heaven itself was knocking out a warning. My chest ached, not from age or illness, but from another kind of pain. The pain of knowing my daughter was ready to betray everything I had taught her since childhood. I once taught Claire that business was not just numbers, but responsibility. I once told her, never forget, every layoff is not only the end of a contract, but the shaking of a home. Yet now it was Claire herself, calculating mass layoffs as if they were clever moves on a chessboard. I stopped at an intersection, staring at the red lights glistening on the wet pavement. In that moment, I realized betrayal never comes from strangers. It comes from those closest, those once most trusted. And the cost of that betrayal was not just losing a CEO seat, not just losing control of a company, but losing faith in one's own blood. Once lost, it can never be regained. I kept driving, closer and closer to Claire's house. Warm light spilled from the kitchen with Trevor, her husband, setting the table. In a moment, I would have to walk in, sit across from my daughter, pretending everything was still normal. But I knew that dinner would not only carry the scent of roasted chicken and wine, it would reek of lies, ambition, and betrayal. And I knew from the moment I stepped through that door, my life would never again be peaceful. The door swung open before I could press the bell. Claire stood there in a cream sweater, her face bright, her smile measured, not too much, not too little. "Dad, right on time," she said, hugging me briefly, awkwardly, like a social courtesy. I walked in, the smell of roasted chicken filling the air, but to me it was acrid, as if covering something hidden. The living room was warm, with golden light spreading evenly, modern decor carefully arranged, not a detail out of place. Trevor was fussing at the table. He looked at me with a smile that felt too wide, his hand gripping firmly when he shook mine. "Glad to see you well, Dad," Trevor said, his voice a little too high, a little too tense. I nodded, my eyes narrowing, sensing the handshake was more than politeness. It was scrutiny. What did Trevor know? Was he part of this plan? Before I could find an answer, a child's voice rang out. "Grandpa!" Sophie, my 4-year-old granddaughter, rushed from the other room in a paint-stained dress. I bent down, lifting her, relieved to find something genuine in this house of pretense. Sophie held up a crayon drawing. "Look! This is you in the office. This is me on the spinning chair, and this is the Carter Systems logo. Clumsy lines, but full of love." I smiled, kissed her forehead, feeling a pure truth no adult could fake. But when I looked up, I caught Claire's eyes watching us. For a moment, something flickered. Jealousy? Regret? Or calculation? I could not be sure, but I knew I had to remember it. We sat at the table. Trevor poured wine for me. while Claire moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of a commander more than a cook. Every gesture was neat, controlled, no different from how she ran shareholder meetings. I sipped the wine, its bitterness coating my tongue, then looked at my daughter. She feigned busyness, avoiding my gaze. "You look tired, Dad," Claire said softly, but the words carried a blade's edge. I replied slowly, "Work keeps me sharp. It makes my mind clearer. By the way, how's the finance department these days?" Claire paused, her wooden spoon hanging midair. "Dad, tonight is dinner, not business." She smiled lightly, turning back to the chicken. I nodded, but inside, I felt the chill. Once, Claire loved nothing more than talking about the company, about projects, and strategy. Now she avoided it, as if afraid I might touch a secret. Dinner began. The smell of chicken, mashed potatoes, and wine mixed into a curtain of false family warmth. Sophie chattered about her art class. Trevor went on about a new architecture project, and Claire occasionally asked me polite questions like a courteous guest, nothing more. But beneath the words, I felt tension like a taut string, ready to snap. "Are you sad, Grandpa?" Sophie suddenly asked, her wide eyes fixed on me. I flinched, my glass stopping midair. "Why do you ask that?" I softened my voice. "Because your eyes look like they're crying, even without tears," Sophie said. The table fell silent. Trevor coughed lightly. Claire forced a laugh. "Kids, always imagining things." But I knew children often spoke truths adults tried to hide. I stroked her hair and said, "Grandpa isn't sad. I'm just thinking about our family." Claire glanced at me, a flicker of unease crossing her eyes before they hardened again. She placed chicken on my plate, her voice soft but pointed. "You should rest more, Dad. The work is too heavy." I looked straight at her, answering evenly, "Work keeps me alive." And I still remember, the company isn't just work, it's the family of thousands. My words landed like a blade on the table. Trevor looked at Claire, and she bent her head, eating as if she had not heard. But I knew she had, and she knew I was not easily cornered. Dinner dragged on, the clink of cutlery on porcelain echoing hollowly. I told Sophie an old story about the days Elena and I built Carter systems in a cramped garage. Sophie's eyes widened in wonder, while Claire froze, her knife pausing, her shoulders stiffening. I knew that just mentioning Elena broke her cold facade. Between us lay an unspoken past. Elena's death while I was consumed by work, a wound Claire had never forgiven. When dinner ended, I stood and thanked them as always. Claire walked me to the door, her smile flawless, as if nothing had happened. "You were different tonight, Dad." "Something wrong?" she asked. I looked at her, her delicate face, but eyes sharp as blades. Eyes no longer belonging to the little girl who once waited for me every evening. I replied slowly, "I was only thinking about the true meaning of family." And of the company. Claire pressed her lips, her smile stiffening. "Drive safe, Dad." "The road is slippery," I nodded and stepped outside. The door shut behind me with a soft but echoing click. I stood on the porch, the cold rain starting to soak my coat. Through the window, I saw Claire clearing the table, her face calm, her hands quick. But I knew, beneath that facade was a plan already written, step by step, to push me aside. I went down the steps, my heart heavy, my mind spinning with questions. My daughter, what had she truly become? The engine roared to life, the wipers slicing through the rain. I drove on, torn between searing pain and unyielding resolve. If Claire wanted this dinner to be theater, then I would show her I could act too, but not to pretend, to tear away the curtain of deceit. And I knew this was only the opening act of a tragedy yet to unfold. That night, I returned to my home on Capitol Hill, weighed down with sorrow. Outside, the rain still poured, drumming on the weathered wooden eaves. The house, once peaceful, once filled with Elena's laughter and Claire's small footsteps, now felt cold as a prison cell. I hung my coat on the rack, sank into the armchair in my study, where the dim yellow lamp could not chase away the darkness inside me. The computer on the desk lit up as I opened my inbox. An encrypted email from Michael appeared, with a cold subject line. Official filing, Hanson v. Carter Systems. I hesitated for a moment before clicking open. A file 48 pages long appeared, dense with words and numbers. At the top of the page, my daughter's name, Claire Carter, stood out beneath the word plaintiff. My heart tightened. I began to read. Each sentence felt like a blade twisting into my chest. Mr. Bill Carter has shown a clear decline in cognitive capacity and managerial ability. Recent decisions are emotional in nature, not based on reasonable financial analysis. They listed every expense I had approved. The Employee Retention Program costing $12 million over 3 years, the Scholarship Fund for Workers' Children, and the annual contribution of $200,000 to the charity bearing Elna's name. All of it was labeled emotional spending lacking a profit basis. I remembered each moment I signed those decisions. I remembered the smiles of engineers when their children received scholarships. I remembered the letters of thanks from workers' families when the company provided medical support. I remembered how Elena smiled gently when she heard me say the fund in her name would live on. And now all of it was twisted into signs of psychological decline. Continuing to read, I saw the list of witnesses. People who once sat with me in board meetings now stood with Claire. They said I seemed irritable when rejecting the proposed merger with Initech Global, that I lost my temper during a discussion when James Corbin suggested automation-driven staff cuts. In their eyes, my resolve had been turned into uncontrolled emotional outbursts. I put a hand to my forehead, cold sweat beading up. Perhaps I did strike the table. Perhaps my voice was louder than usual. But that was because I was defending the work of 3,000 people, not because I had lost my mind. The last page froze my blood. We request that the King County Court temporarily transfer the management authority of Carter Systems, Inc. to Ms. Claire Carter, while conducting psychiatric and intellectual capacity evaluations of Mr. Bill Carter. We request the appointment of an interim board of directors to protect shareholder interests. Each line fell like a hammer blow. My daughter did not just want to replace me. She wanted to bury my honor, to turn me into a senile old man in the eyes of this entire city. I sank into the chair, my eyes fixed on the photo on my desk. It was a picture of Elena taken a few months before she passed. A gentle smile, a gaze full of forgiveness, as if she wanted to tell me something. I seemed to hear her old words echoing, "Bill, you must learn to be with your family, not just with your work." I had thought I was doing everything for the family, for Claire, for the future, but perhaps, in Claire's eyes, I had never truly been present, and that absence had turned into resentment, into a blade now driven straight into my heart. I poured a glass of whiskeys, my hand trembling. The yellow light shone on the amber liquid. I took a large sip, feeling fire burn down my throat, but not warm the chill inside. I asked myself, was I truly wrong? Had I become a stubborn old man, living forever in the past, afraid of change? But immediately I recalled what Claire was plotting. A merger with Initech Global, mass layoffs, turning people who had devoted their lives into numbers in a spreadsheet. No, that was not renewal. That was betrayal. That night, I sat in the study until late, reading the file over and over, noting each point, marking every absurdity. Every sentence was a cut, but also an alarm bell. Claire thought I would collapse, that I would give up. But I knew that if I fell, not only would I lose everything, but 3,000 employees and thousands of families would lose their homes. Outside, the rain would not stop. I looked through the window, and the raindrops were like the city's tears falling. But inside me, a small flame began to kindle. If Claire wanted to turn the court into an arena, I would step onto it. If she wanted to turn me into a helpless old man, I would show her I was still the man who built Carter Systems with 2 empty hands. I set down the glass and opened my notebook. I wrote the first lines: counter-offensive plan. And at that very moment, I swore this battle would not be only about keeping the CEO seat. It would be a fight to keep the company's soul, to protect all the workers Claire had forgotten. And above all, it would be a fight for me to reclaim the right to be a father worthy of Elena and of myself. That night, the clock read 2 o'clock in the morning, yet I still sat motionless in the study. On the desk, Claire's lawsuit file lay there like an unhealed wound. The pale yellow light fell on Elena's face in the framed photo. She looked at me with the familiar, gentle gaze, as if asking, "What are you going to do next?" I picked up a pen and wrote the first lines in the notebook. Not just keeping the CEO seat. This is a battle to keep the company's soul, keep our honor, keep the promise to Elena. I recalled the first days of Carter Systems. It was not just a company, but the shared dream of a husband and wife. We once stayed up all night in the garage, our hands covered in circuit dust, just to test a crazy idea. When the company succeeded, Elena cried through her smile, "You did it, Bill! But do not let work take away the family I promised," and then broke the promise. Now the price I pay is the resentment in my daughter's eyes. I knew I could not fight Claire alone. She already had a team of lawyers, shareholders, and a sweet vision to offer. I had only the truth, but sometimes the truth is not enough. I needed allies, people who still believed in the values I had built. I picked up the phone and dialed Steve Wilson, the confidant and co-founder of Carter Systems from the earliest days. After a few rings, the familiar husky voice came on. "Bill, calling this late must mean something big." I took a deep breath and told the whole story. The other end was silent for a long moment, and then Steve sighed. "I have heard whispers." Claire approached both Corbin and Patricia. "They are dazzled by numbers. But Bill, I am here. You are not alone." Hearing that, a weight lifted from my shoulders. We arranged to meet the next morning at Steve's small office near Lake Union. I knew this would be more than a meeting of two friends. It would be two comrades preparing for a long campaign. Setting down the phone, I returned to the desk and opened the computer. Michael had sent another email with a list of things to do immediately. I read each line carefully, review all personal and corporate finances, gather medical evidence regarding mental and physical condition, prepare witnesses among long-tenured employees, and most importantly, build the counter-narrative. I smiled bitterly. Claire thought she had planned thoroughly, but she forgot one thing. I had spent my life in business battles where a small mistake could sink a company, and this time I would not lose. I opened the safe and took out a bundle of Elena's old letters. In them were lines she wrote in her final days. "Remember, the company matters, but people matter more. If one day Claire forgets this, you must remind her." I held the letters, feeling strength return. Elena had foreseen this danger, and now it was time for me to keep my promise. Outside, the rain had eased. I stepped onto the balcony and looked toward a city still glittering with lights. Seattle that night was strangely quiet, as if holding its breath before a storm. I raised my face to the gloomy sky and vowed in my heart, "Claire, I will not let you destroy everything. If you have chosen this path, I will show you who taught you how to fight." Returning to the study, I began drafting a more detailed plan. This battle had 3 fronts: legal, shareholders, and public opinion. On the legal front, Michael would take charge. On the shareholder front, Steve and I would approach each person in turn, not with empty promises, but with hard proof. Carter Systems is stable, sustainably growing, and any plan for mass layoffs will make the company lose its soul, lose its reputation, and then lose profit. And on the public front, I knew I had to prepare. The media always loves stories of broken families, but if I tell it right, the public will clearly see where greed lies and where responsibility stands. The clock hands pointed to nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. I closed the notebook, yet my mind was still razor sharp. I knew the road ahead would be full of mud and blood, but I also knew there was no way back. Not only for the company, not only for 3,000 employees, but also for Claire's very soul. If I lost, she would believe that betraying her parents and betraying workers was the only path to success, and that I could not accept. I sat in silence for a long time, then put all the papers into the leather briefcase, preparing for tomorrow's meeting with Steve. Before turning off the light, I looked once more at Elena's photo. I promise, this time I won't miss the family. I will do everything, not only to keep the company, but to keep our daughter. Elena's eyes in the frame seemed to glow in the dark, as if nodding in agreement. I climbed into bed but could not sleep. In my head, layers of strategies lined up like a chessboard, revealing their moves. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving only the wind hissing through the trees. I knew tomorrow's dawn would not bring peace. It would bring a storm, and I was ready to face it. The next morning, Seattle's sky was still covered in a thick, tarry gray. Clouds hung heavy over the city like a weighted blanket, just like my mood. I drove to Steve Wilson's small office, an old red brick building right by Lake Union. We had sat in this room 25 years ago when we were young, when the dream of Carter Systems had only just begun to form. This time, we sat here not to start up, but to keep that dream from being crushed by my own daughter. Steve opened the door to greet me, his hair now white, but his eyes flashing with the familiar quickness. "Bill, you look terrible," he said, but his firm handshake carried a wordless pledge. I sat on the old leather chair, drew a long breath, then opened the briefcase and spread the lawsuit file on the table. Dim light slanted through the window onto pages full of accusations. Steve picked one bundle up, flipped a few pages, then growled, "Unbelievable. Claire. She wrote this with her own hand." I nodded, my throat tightening. Steve sighed, poured 2 cups of strong black coffee, and set one before me. "You know, Bill," he said slowly, "I still remember the day we hired Claire as an intern. She was quick, sharp, and loved by the staff. I once thought she would become a great CEO. He paused, eyes drifting. "But now?" I took a bitter, necessary sip. "Claire chose a different path. She wants to merge Carter Systems with Initech Global. She promised shareholders 15% profits each year. But Steve, you and I both know the real price is 3,000 people out of work. The company culture ground to dust." Steve nodded hard, his palm thumping the old wooden desk. "You're right. Claire no longer sees the people behind the numbers. She only sees money." We sat in silence for a while, hearing only the ticking clock and the distant lap of Lake Union on the shore. Then Steve pulled a thick file from the drawer. "I've been watching for months," he said. "Claire began approaching shareholders half a year ago. She sent private emails to each one, promising different things. To Corbin, soaring profits. To Patricia, a strategic restructuring report. To the 3 young shareholders, a vision of becoming technology pioneers if we merge with Initech. Each promise is tailored to each target. Very clever, but very dangerous. I skimmed emails and charts. Exaggerated numbers, fanciful scenarios. I saw Claire's hand clearly. Ambitious, daring, but blind. "We have to counterattack," I said firmly. "This evidence will show she's selling the company's future cheaply just to win support." Steve nodded, eyes brightening. "Yes, but not only that. We must prove Carter Systems is growing sustainably, that the current model is not only good, but far safer." We spread the past 3 years' reports on the table. Revenue had grown steadily at 11 to 12% a year. The retention rate was 94%, nearly 30 percentage points above the industry average. Customer satisfaction stood at 95%, all resounding proof that Carter Systems needed no shock therapy to survive. Steve looked at me, a rare smile flickering. "Bill, this is our weapon. Claire has airy visions. We have reality, but I knew numbers alone were not enough. I leaned back and looked straight at Steve. We need something else. The story. We must show shareholders, the public, and the court that behind Carter Systems are people. If Claire wins, not only will the company be sold short, but thousands of families will lose their footing. And I, Bill Carter, will not let that happen. Steve was quiet for a few seconds, and then slowly nodded. The story. Yes, we have to strike the heart, not just the head. He sipped his coffee and added, But Bill, brace yourself. Claire isn't a novice. She's hired Laura Blake, the lawyer who specializes in turning fathers into senile old men. She turns the court into a stage. If we only defend, we'll lose. I clenched my fist. Then we'll write a different script. One where I am not just the accused, but the father defending thousands of employees against bottomless greed. If Laura Blake turns the court into a stage, I'll show her I'm the one who built this stage. Steve's eyes lit up. He smiled again, broader this time. That's the Bill Carter I know. You don't back down. We stayed until noon, sketching a strategy map, which shareholders could still be persuaded, which witnesses would stand with me, which documents we needed to expose Claire's exaggerations. Each sheet laid out a new move. I felt my blood heat, not last night's despair, but a general's battle fire. When I left Steve's office, the rain had stopped. Lake Union mirrored the leaden sky, with a faint streak of light in the distance. I knew the road ahead was still stormy, but now I was no longer alone. I had Steve, I had Michael, I had the truth, and above all, I had a reason greater than any courtroom to protect the people who had given their lives to Carter Systems. And for them, I would face any enemy, even one who shared my blood. 3 days later, I arranged to meet Claire at a small cafe by Pike Place Market, where Elena used to take the family on weekends. I chose a seat by the window, looking out at the morning bustle, bright flower stalls, and lively calls. I arrived 15 minutes early, tension coiled like awaiting a match with no referee. At exactly 2:15, Claire walked in, wearing a dark gray suit, hair tied back, eyes sharp as a blade. She scanned the cafe, spotted me, and came over with firm steps like a lawyer heading to the lectern. "Dad," Claire said, her voice cool and courteous. She sat opposite, carefully set her bag beside her. I looked closely and noticed her shoulders were thinner than before, and there was a hint of fatigue in her eyes. But behind it all, ambition still burned. I began low-voiced, "Claire, why didn't you speak to me directly? Why turn everything into a lawsuit?" She looked at me, the corner of her mouth lifting in a stiff, bitter smile. "I tried, many times, but you were always busy. The company was always more important." I paused, a stab in my chest, but kept steady. I built Carter Systems not for myself, but for the family. "For you," Claire gave a short, dry laugh. "No, you built it for yourself. For your ego. How many family dinners were cut short by calls? How many vacations were canceled due to meetings? You were never really there for me and Mom." Her words pricked like 1,000 needles. I wanted to refute her, to explain that every sacrifice was for her future, but I knew that in her eyes all she had seen was absence. I sighed and looked straight into my daughter's eyes. "Claire, I won't deny my shortcomings, but what you're doing now is a betrayal of everyone who has stood by this company. Do you know what a merger with Initech means? 3,000 people will lose their jobs. Those people have given their lives to Carter Systems. They are not just numbers." Claire furrowed her brows, her gaze icy. "You always talk about employees and loyalty, but do you know how far the company is falling behind? Initech has AI and automation and has a global model. What about us? Slow, conservative, lulling ourselves to sleep with a 12% growth rate." I growled. 12% is sustainable growth. It comes from loyalty, from trust. You call that conservatism, but that is why we have survived for 30 years, without collapsing like companies that chase fads. Claire leaned forward, her voice sharp as a blade. You do not understand. This is not just business. This is a struggle for survival. If we do not change, we will die. If we do not merge, Carter Systems will be left behind. I looked into her eyes, the eyes that once lit up when she was little, every time she waited for me to come home. Now burning with a different fire, the fire of ambition and anger. I spoke slowly, each word heavy as stone. Claire, the company is not dying. You just want it bigger, faster to satisfy your thirst for success. But you forget that the faster something grows, the easier it breaks. I did not build Carter Systems to turn it into a soulless corpse. The air between us was taut like a string. Outside, the cries of flower sellers and the distant sound of waves all felt unfamiliar. Only father and daughter remained, facing off, not backing down. I saw in Claire's eyes not only ambition, but a deep pain. Her voice trembled slightly, yet she kept her pride. You never saw me as good enough. You never said I did well. I have tried all my life to be recognized, but you only saw the company. I was stunned. So behind all the schemes and calculations was a daughter who had longed for her father's recognition. I felt as if I had taken a punch to the heart. I wanted to reach out my hand, then pulled it back. Between us now was a chasm that could not be bridged by a single touch. The conversation lasted nearly 1 hour, but brought no reconciliation. Claire stood first, her eyes hard, her voice full of challenge. You can bring witnesses, bring numbers, bring everything you want, but I will win. I will save Carter Systems from obsolescence. She turned and strode toward the door, leaving me alone with a cup of cold coffee. I watched her figure and remembered the little girl who used to wave goodbye to me every morning, and I felt my heart crack. I sat a while longer, then stood and stepped outside. Seattle's sky was still thick gray, but the wind had risen. I knew that after this conversation there was no room for half measures. Claire had chosen her path, and I, Bill Carter, had chosen mine. If she wanted to make the courtroom the place of decision, then I would turn it into a battlefield to show everyone that Carter Systems is not just a name, but the blood, sweat, and faith of thousands. And I swore I would not let those people be betrayed. On the first day of the hearing, Seattle's sky sank under a thin curtain of rain, droplets like tinsel falling onto the wet streets. I wore a dark blue suit and a silver-striped tie, walking slowly into the King County Courthouse. The great wooden doors opened onto a sea of people, reporters jostling, lenses flashing, questions firing. Mr. Carter, have you truly lost the ability to manage? Mr. Carter, Claire says you are endangering the company's future. What do you say? I kept silent, my footsteps echoing, trying to keep my shoulders from bowing under the weight of the questions. In the courtroom, Claire was already seated at the plaintiff's table. She wore a black suit, her face cold, hair neat, eyes blazing with resolve. Beside her was Laura Blake, the famed finance litigator who had forced many veteran CEOs from their chairs after only a few sessions. Laura looked at me with a thin smile, eyes calculating as if I were just another prey on her long list. Behind them, the row of shareholders supporting Claire sat in order, including James Corbin with a smug face, eyes gleaming at the scent of profit. I sat beside Michael Reed, my attorney. Michael set a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Stay calm. This is only the beginning. We do not need to win yet. We just need to hold." I nodded, but my heart pounded like war drums. The hearing began. Laura Blake rose, her voice ringing, each word like a knife. Your Honor, we are here today to protect Carter Systems from the clear decline in Mr. Bill Carter's leadership capacity. The man who once founded this company is no longer lucid enough to lead it forward. His decisions have repeatedly lacked a financial basis, been emotional in nature, and directly threatened the interests of thousands of shareholders. She raised charts, images, and financial reports. Each detail in the complaint was projected onto the large screen like irrefutable proof. Claire was called to the stand. I watched my daughter walk, each step confident. Her voice sounded clear and precise. I love this company, and because of that love, I had to act. My father has changed. After my mother passed away, he became erratic. He approved millions of dollars for projects that brought no profit, and he refused to merge with Inotech, a golden opportunity for Carter Systems to enter a new era. If we keep going like this, the company will die. I am not doing this for myself. I am doing it for thousands of employees and for the future. Each of Claire's words fell like a hammer. I sat still, keeping my face calm, but inside was a storm. I knew she was telling half-truths, hiding the fact that 3,000 employees would lose their jobs if we merged, but those in the room only heard the pretty words. In the shareholders' row, a few nodded. Reporters scribbled frantically. I felt as if I were being marched into the public square for judgment, while the betrayer was hailed as a savior. When it was my turn, Michael stood, his voice firm. Your Honor, Mr. Bill Carter is not senile. He is the founder who has led Carter Systems for 30 years with steady success, sustainable profit, and, most importantly, a humane culture admired across the industry. His refusal to merge is not a sign of decline, but of foresight, to protect thousands of employees from layoffs. Michael presented growth reports, retention rates, and letters of thanks from employees' families. But compared to Claire's rousing words, they felt like small slips of paper trying to withstand a flood. Laura countered immediately. She showed an image of me at a meeting, striking the table, my voice raised in anger. This is evidence of uncontrolled emotional outbursts, she said with a sneer. Is this the man we trust to run a $500 million company? Murmurs spread through the room. I felt my face burn, veins straining. When the session recessed, I stepped into the hallway. Reporters swarmed. One asked, Mr. Carter, your daughter says you are no longer lucid. What do you have to say? I kept silent, but inside, flames roared. I looked toward Claire. She stood with her shareholder group, smiling faintly, confident as if she had already won the opening round. In that moment, I understood this was not just a legal battle. This was a public war, where every gesture and glance would be scrutinized, and if I did not change tactics, I would lose before the real fight began. Michael came to my side, his hand on my shoulder. Bill, they are hitting harder than I expected. But trust me, this match is not decided. We still have weapons we have not revealed. I drew a deep breath and looked straight at the courtroom doors. I knew that next time I walked in, I could not be only a defendant. I had to be the father, the founder, the protector. And I swore I would not be publicly humiliated one more time. The first hearing ended, leaving me with an indescribable shame. That night, I sat in the large but cold office, the yellow light spilling over walls lined with awards, certificates, and family photos, now tinged with bitterness. I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat motionless, staring into the darkness beyond the window where Seattle sank in rain. Since losing Elena, I had often asked myself whether I still had the strength to shoulder all of Carter Systems. But tonight, for the first time, I understood clearly that if I did not shoulder it, thousands would lose everything. Families with small children, workers who had given their youth to the company, all would become victims if Claire's merger plan succeeded. That thought erased my fatigue and sent hot blood surging. I knew I had to strike back. The next morning, I called Michael and Steve to the office. Steve Wilson, the companion from the very first day of founding the company, brought an old leather briefcase. He set it on the table, opened it, and inside were stacks of color-printed documents, charts, and internal emails he had collected. I looked at him, surprised. How did you get these? Steve sighed, his eyes tired but resolute. Bill, you know I still hold high-level access in the storage system as a co-founder and founding shareholder. And more importantly, a few loyal employees, worried by Claire's empty promises, secretly sent me copies of emails and meeting recordings. They do not want the company sold cheap, nor do they want their families falling into unemployment. His words stunned me. So there was still light in the dark, still people willing to stand up for the truth. Michael began skimming. His eyes narrowed, then he gave a thin, cold smile. She dug her own grave. On the table, the email pages showed clearly that Claire had promised a 20% raise for engineers, 30% for department heads, even floated a plan to grant stock bonuses to a slew of key personnel. The numbers sounded attractive, but anyone with basic financial sense knew they were impossible to realize. Where would the money come from? Claire was counting on a huge savings from firing more than 3,000 long-tenured employees, people with higher salaries and full benefits. I felt my heart clamp tight. That was exactly the truth I feared. Claire did not care about those who had given themselves to this place. She cared about profit charts to persuade shareholders hungry for quick wealth. I looked at a photo from a 10-year anniversary party for the software engineering group, familiar faces beaming under the lights. How many of them would have to go if that plan became reality? The thought twisted like a blade in my chest, but at the same time hardened into resolve. Steve was not finished. He handed me a financial statement. Lines of transfers, totaling nearly $850,000, had been made by Claire over the last 3 months. The money went to nameless consulting firms, some personal accounts, and even into a fund for legal expenses. Michael slammed the file on the table. This is proof of embezzlement. She used company money to finance the very war against her own father. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at a city catching the first light. The fog was thinning. The first rays fell on the Duwamish, glittering on the water. For the first time in months, I felt hope. We will use this, I said, calm but with an edge, not only to protect the company, but to expose the truth to all shareholders, to the court, and to the public. Michael nodded, his eyes brightening. We will not just defend any more, Bill. This will be an offensive. I will prepare a countersuit. Financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, intentional harm to shareholders, and most importantly, we will prove that you are not only lucid, but more clear-headed than anyone. Meanwhile, Steve opened his laptop and showed me a series of emails between Claire and the Corbin block. In them, Claire promised outstanding profits through a total overhaul, which meant replacing people with automated systems. This is the naked truth, Steve said. She is selling the company's soul for a fantasy. We must show everyone the consequences if they believe her. I returned to the table and picked up a bundle of papers. They were handwritten letters from employees sent to me for the company's 30th anniversary. One engineer wrote that Carter's systems helped him buy his first home. An accountant wrote that the company funded her daughter's college tuition. I read each word, my hand trembling. This was the strongest proof. A company is not just numbers. It is a family, the life of thousands. That night, sitting alone, I thought of Elna. She once said, Bill, if one day I am no longer here, remember money is not the most important legacy. People are the legacy. I had never truly grasped her words until this moment. Claire had forgotten that, but I could not. I opened the notebook and wrote a single line. Fight not only for the company, but for the people who have given their lives here. When I closed it, I knew a new page had turned. From the one being forced onto the defensive, I now held cards enough to flip the board. And this time, I would protect not only my honor, but the big family called Carter Systems. The second day of the hearing dawned under a gray sky, but inside me it was brighter than ever. This time, I did not enter the courtroom feeling passive, not as the father cornered by his daughter, but as a commander carrying knockout evidence. Michael Reed walked beside me with a heavy black case stuffed with documents, statements, and emails Steve had gathered. Steve was there too, his eyes sharp behind silver frames. We passed the reporters without answering a single question, keeping only a cold, steady bearing. Today, the truth would not be hidden. In the courtroom, Claire and Laura Blake sat at the plaintiff's table. Claire still wore her confident look, a neat ash-gray suit, a cold face, eyes fixed on me as if to assert she had already won. But I saw a slight tension at the corner of her mouth, a sign she had not expected me to press the fight. Laura sat beside her, features razor-sharp and the same mocking smile. Yet I noticed her hand gripping the file tighter than usual. Perhaps somewhere her professional instinct warned her the day would not go smoothly. The judge struck the gavel. The session began. Laura opened with a showy speech, the same refrain about a father out of control and a company needing renewal. But this time, fewer ears were rapt. Shareholders whispered. Reporters looked around expectant, and then Michael rose. He did not hurry or grandstand. He simply opened the case, took out a thick stack of documents, each sheet tabbed and numbered. Your Honor, he began, his voice low but authoritative, today we present evidence that the plaintiff, Ms. Claire Carter, has committed serious breaches of fiduciary and financial duty, directly endangering Carter Systems and its thousands of employees. The room fell still for a beat. Laura frowned. Claire flinched slightly. Michael put a financial statement on the screen. The figures were plain. 3 transfers totaling $746,000 from company accounts to shadowy consultancies and even personal accounts. These are transfers made without board approval and absent from any financial plan. According to our investigation, these funds were used to pay legal fees for this lawsuit and to lobby shareholders against Mr. Bill Carter, the company's lawful founder. A murmur rolled through the courtroom. Cameras clicked. A few shareholders whispered loudly enough to hear, "Embezzlement." The judge rapped for order. Laura sprang up, sharp-voiced. "Objection!" These materials are outside the scope of this case. But the judge looked straight at her. Crisp. Overruled. This evidence relates directly to the plaintiff's capacity and motive. Laura sat, her face draining. Michael moved to the email thread between Claire and James Corbin, projected behind him. In it, Claire pledged compensation packages and financial outcomes far beyond the company's real capacity, premised on a total overhaul, whose social cost was hidden. Michael lowered his voice so each word fell clear. In other words, the plaintiff built illusions on the instability of thousands of working families. In exchange for personal power, I looked around the room and saw shock on faces. A few long-tenured employees present that day clenched their hands, eyes reddening. Emotion surged in me, and when allowed to speak, I stepped to the lectern, my voice trembling slightly but firm with resolve. I have spent 30 years building Carter Systems, not only to generate profit, but to build a home for more than 5,000 people. Engineers, staff, accountants, guards, all are part of this family. Claire, my daughter, has chosen another road, to sell the company's soul for a few pretty numbers on a profit sheet. If her plan succeeds, 3,000 families will lose their livelihood. This is not renewal. This is betrayal. The whole room sank into silence. I saw many eyes lower, including some shareholders who had once supported Claire. Michael continued, this time presenting an audio recording of a secret meeting Claire had held with a group of department heads, where she promised salaries and benefits far beyond the company's financial capacity. The recording played, Claire's voice unmistakably clear. When the leadership chair changes, resources will be reallocated, and the budget for new commitments will naturally appear. The courtroom froze. Claire's face turned pale, while Laura Blake bent down, flipping through files, visibly flustered. The rest of the trial unfolded like a predetermined chess match. Every time Laura tried to object, Michael produced new evidence, financial reports, employee testimonies, even an expert financial analysis proving Claire's plan was not only unfeasible, but also carried the risk of bankruptcy. Shareholders whispered more loudly. Some openly turned their backs on Claire. When the hearing ended on a cold, rainy afternoon, I walked into the hallway, no longer the accused, but the man who had exposed the truth. Claire remained seated in the courtroom, her vacant eyes fixed on her hands. Laura Blake tried hard to say something to her, but I knew the battle had shifted. Reporters rushed forward, and this time they no longer asked about my sanity, but pressed relentlessly. "Mr. Carter, do you think Claire will face criminal charges?" I did not answer, only looked straight into the cameras, my eyes calm. Because at that moment, I knew one thing for certain. The war was not over, but from here on, the board belonged entirely to me. After the second hearing, public opinion exploded like an uncontrollable storm. Major financial newspapers from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal simultaneously ran front-page headlines. Claire Carter, accused of embezzling nearly $750,000 from father's company to fund internal lawsuit. Television channels replayed the audio of Claire, promising raises and firing longtime employees. The internet flooded with furious comments. On Twitter, a hashtag spread rapidly. #SaveCarterEmployees. Thousands shared their own stories, the years they had worked at Carter Systems, the benefits the company had brought to their families, and their fear if Claire's merger plan became reality. Within a few days, Claire fell from the image of an ambitious young woman to an ungrateful betrayer in the eyes of the public. Calls poured into my office. Some old friends called simply to say, "Bill, you did the right thing." Claire went too far, but there were also calls that weighed heavily on me. Elena's brother, once very close to Claire, said over the phone, "Bill, I never thought she could do this. Our side of the family is shocked and deeply angry. You need to know that from today, Claire is no longer welcome at family gatherings." I stayed silent, because in every word I heard despair. In town, at Sunday church services, the story became a topic of gossip. I attended as usual, but the moment I stepped in, dozens of eyes fell on me. Some patted my shoulder, whispering, "You've been through enough. Stay strong." But others were harsher, staring at me and saying, "If you hadn't abandoned your family to chase the company, Claire would never have ended up like this." I swallowed the lump in my throat and did not respond, because I understood that public opinion can be crueler than any court ruling. Carter Systems shareholders also lost patience with Claire. James Corbin, who had once been eager to support her, suddenly issued a public letter withdrawing his support. In the letter he wrote, "I believe I was misled by false promises. I place my full trust in Mr. Bill Carter's leadership, a dizzying turnaround, but typical in the financial world. Loyalty is never to a person, only to profit. Once they saw Claire was no longer a winning card, they abandoned her without hesitation. That was everything that had happened. I had lost much, but in the end, I still held on to what mattered most: justice and family. If you believe this story deserves to spread, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video. Your support is my greatest motivation to continue. Even Claire's closest friends turned their backs. Some posted on social media screenshots of messages Claire had sent, boasting, "My father will have to sit and watch me take it all." Those messages were like final knives cutting deeply into her dignity. The online community, already furious, grew even angrier. Financial YouTubers' videos analyzing the merger plan reached millions of views, dissecting every inhumane detail, predicting the mass unemployment of thousands of workers if Claire won. The public poured out their sympathy for me. The father determined to protect his workers, and reserved for Claire only undisguised hatred. The family was also swept into the storm. I heard that Trevor's mother, Claire's mother-in-law, had cried heavily after reading the news. She called me, her voice trembling. "Bill, I'm sorry on behalf of my son for not stopping Claire, but please save her. She has no way out." I did not answer immediately. My heart was torn in two, one side filled with anger at Claire's actions, the other with compassion for the daughter I once carried, once taught to walk her first steps. Meanwhile, relatives who had once supported Claire now publicly criticized her. At a weekend gathering, a cousin spoke loudly in front of everyone. Claire is the disgrace of this family. She forgot blood ties, forgot her father, forgot her roots just to chase money. I stood there in silence, not responding, but my heart ached. I knew Claire was no longer fighting only me, but was fighting against the entire world. The pressure of public opinion grew so heavy that some of her old friends avoided her. Neighbors whispered behind her back. Trevor, despite his efforts to defend his wife, grew increasingly exhausted. I heard he went to work late and left early, avoiding colleagues, because everyone talked about the wife who betrayed her own father. Claire's little family was isolated in an invisible cage. For me, the fury of public opinion was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it solidified my position, pulling the remaining shareholders firmly to my side. But on the other, it pushed Claire deeper into the abyss than ever before. I did not feel the glee many expected. Instead, I felt empty. I had won, but the price was my daughter's honor being shredded under the public spotlight. That night, I sat in my office, staring out the window at the bright lights of Seattle. I remembered when Claire was small, often sitting on my lap while I worked, her hands playing with the early sketches of Carter systems. She once said, "Daddy, one day I will work with you." How bitterly ironic that dream had become a nightmare. I placed my hand on the desk, silently thinking, tomorrow the court will rule. And no matter the outcome, I must find a way to save this father-daughter relationship, or I will lose Claire forever. On the morning the court delivered its verdict, the sky over Seattle broke with a rare early summer light, but my heart was heavy as stone. I entered the courtroom and sat in the familiar row of seats. Claire was already there, her face gaunt, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Trevor sat beside her, gripping her hand as if to give her the last bit of strength. Laura Blake tried to maintain professionalism, but I could see she no longer had a trace of confidence. This battle had turned all of them into defeated figures, even before the judgment was read. The judge struck the gavel, and the room fell silent. His voice echoed slow and deliberate. After reviewing all evidence, testimony, and documents, the court concludes that Mr. Bill Carter is fully capable of managing Carter systems. There is no basis to strip him of his leadership. The lawsuit filed by the plaintiff, Ms. Claire Carter, is dismissed. I took a deep breath, my chest released after months of tension. But before joy could spread, the judge continued. Furthermore, evidence of unauthorized transfers and misleading promises to shareholders will be forwarded to federal investigators for further action. The court recommended that the plaintiff fully cooperate in the next steps. A murmur erupted. Reporters hurriedly took notes, some unable to resist, immediately leaving the room to break the news. Claire sat frozen, her lips trembling, her eyes fixed on the wooden floor as if there was nowhere left to cling. Trevor squeezed her hand tighter, but his face was just as dark, like a man who had lost everything. I turned to look at my daughter, and a strange ache welled up inside me. I had won, but why did I feel no relief? Instead, there was a vast emptiness. Claire was my own flesh and blood, the little girl who once clung to my legs when she first learned to walk. Now she sat there, drowning in humiliation, in the whispers of a crowd that saw her as a traitor. When the court declared the session adjourned, everyone stood. I slowly walked out, but then heard a faint call behind me. "Dad?" I stopped. Claire stood there, eyes red, her voice breaking. I never thought it would come to this. I looked straight at her, seeing in her eyes both Elena's likeness and a strange distance. "But it has come to this, Claire." I was about to turn away, but her gaze held me. In that moment, I no longer saw an adversary, a betrayer, but only a lost daughter begging for a thread to reconnect. I sighed softly. "You may have lost a battle, but you haven't lost everything. If you truly want to make things right, start over, not with schemes, but with the truth. Claire nodded faintly, tears falling silently. Trevor bowed his head to thank me, his eyes carrying a fragile glimmer of hope. 1 week later, we met by the shore of Lake Union, not in a cold courtroom, but in the open air, with cool breezes and golden sunlight. Claire wore a simple sweater, no longer the cold armor of a business suit. She sat beside me, the initial distance slowly closing. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling. "All my life, I just wanted to prove I was good enough, strong enough to follow in your footsteps. But I chose the wrong way. I stayed silent, letting her speak. I forgot that behind the numbers, the profit charts, are people. I turned the company into a weapon against the very father who gave it to me." I turned, looking straight into her eyes. "Claire, I never wanted the company to be a burden for you. I wanted it to be a place where you and others could build a future. But I was wrong. I didn't say that enough. So you thought I only cared about the company and not the family." She broke down, burying her face in her hands. I placed a hand on her shoulder, my heart softening. "You may have lost the trust of shareholders, lost your image before the public, but you haven't lost your father. And if you want, we can still begin again, from this company, from this family." A few months later, inside Carter Systems' main boardroom, the atmosphere was different. I stood before the shareholders, but this time beside me was Claire. I announced, "From today, Carter Systems will be led by 2 generations. I will serve as co-CEO alongside my daughter. Together we will balance innovation with preservation, profit with social responsibility. None of our loyal employees will be abandoned. This company is not just machines, it is people." A round of applause erupted. Claire looked at me, her eyes shining for the first time in months. She was no longer my adversary, but once again, my ally, my daughter. That evening, we had dinner together at home. Trevor chatted happily while Sophie, my granddaughter, ran around the table laughing. Claire went into the kitchen cooking lasagna from Elena's recipe. When she brought it to the table, the aroma brought back countless memories. I looked at my family, then up at Elena's photo on the wall. Inside me rose a certainty. She would be pleased, because after everything we had found our way back to each other. My victory was not only keeping the company, but saving the family from the brink of collapse. Justice had been served, the public had found satisfaction, but above all, my heart had finally found peace. And I understood the greatest legacy I could leave was not Carter Systems, but a family that knew how to heal after brokenness.